Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Letterman with the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series today. I work in Fish and Wildlife, and we're really excited today. We're going to be talking about ciscos and other whitefish species, how important they are to our lakes, and they're such a important component in many ways. And so we have three of our fisheries researchers and managers with us today from the northeastern part of the state: Beth Holbrook, Cory Goldsworthy, and EJ Isaac. We're so excited to have them here to talk about this really unique and fun species. So I'm going to turn it over to Beth, and she's going to start going through the presentation. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you. So I'm excited to be here today. My name is Beth Holbrook. I'm a fisheries research scientist at the Minnesota DNR, and Cory, EJ, and I are excited to talk about ciscos, and we'll also be talking about lake whitefish, which are a closely related species. So I just want to show this first slide. These are all sexually mature adult cisco from some of our different inland lakes. And you'll notice that there's some pretty big size differences here. In some of our inland lakes and in Lake Superior, we can actually get cisco that grow up to about 20 inches in length. In other lakes, like 10 Mile, we actually have stunted populations of cisco that only reach about 7 inches. So the size of the cisco is related to the lake habitat and the individual lakes where they are found. So just to sort of introduce the two species, we will be talking today about cisco. They're also referred to as tullibee and lake herring. So these are all the same species, they're all cisco. Lake herring is typically used more around Lake Superior, and tullibee is sort of an inland term sometimes used, but they're all Coregonus artidae, they're all cisco, as well as lake whitefish. You can see that both of these species look pretty similar. They are both members of the family Salmonidae. So these include salmon and trout species like lake trout and brook trout as well. All the family Salmonidae have adipose fins, which is this kind of fatty little fin that's found right before the caudal fin. And lake whitefish and cisco are both members of the genus Coregonus, so they're really closely related. And the way that we tell the difference is actually their mouth structure. So lake whitefish have sort of an overbite. They have a mouth that's specially oriented to feed on the lake the bottom of the lake. And then cisco have sort of an underbite, so they're more oriented upward to feed in the water column. In addition to the differences with their mouth structure, there are also differences in distribution. Lake whitefish are found all the way out to Alaska, whereas cisco are really just sort of in the Hudson Bay drainage and the Great Lakes. But Minnesota is at the southern edge of the range for both of these species. So where do they live in Minnesota? There was a study that was done that looked at the temperature during peak summer, so July and August, where there was enough oxygen for cold water species like lake trout, lake whitefish, burbot, and cisco. And the lakes that have lake trout are the coldest lakes in Minnesota, so it's the fewest number of lakes, but lake whitefish actually need the second coldest water. And so we find lake whitefish and cisco, sort of this sort of medium blue and light blue color, are really just found in the northern forest region of Minnesota, so sort of the very northern parts of Minnesota in the northeast. Cisco can tolerate a little bit warmer temperatures, and so we'll find those a little bit farther south. They'll be in the temperate forest region of Minnesota, as well as the northern forest region. And you'll notice that there's not a lot of cisco lakes or lake whitefish lakes in the prairie region. Those lakes tend to be shallower and warmer, and these are cold water fish, so they need the really deep, cold, clear water of lakes that we find in northern Minnesota. So cisco, the behavior of cisco and lake whitefish differ a little bit. Cisco tends to be in the open water offshore areas of the lake, so out in the middle of the lake. They do suspend in the water column, so typically off the bottom a little bit. They have a schooling behavior, so during the day they're schooled up into pretty tight schools that kind of break up at night, and then once it gets light enough, they school up again. But they do stay deep in the water column if they have good oxygen. So related to that, what they eat is kind of related to where they are in the water column. They will also eat food that's suspended in the water column, so food like zooplankton, such as copepods and daphnia and other cladocerans, and then sometimes midge larvae that come up off the bottom and migrate up through the water column at night. In contrast, lake whitefish have that benthic-oriented mouth, so they are also, most of their behavior, they're affiliated with the bottom of the lake or the benthic zone of the lake. They can occupy shallow nearshore habitats if the temperatures are cold enough, but because they're sort of benthic fish, they eat benthic organisms or bottom-dwelling organisms, things like amphipods or scuds. They'll also eat larvae like caddisfly larvae and chironomid larvae, also known as lake fly larvae. They'll eat aquatic worms, and then they will also eat minnows and small fish, especially benthic fish that they might come across. So why are these two species important? Well, they're important for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that they are excellent forage for muskellunge, northern pike, walleye, lake trout, and also even common loons will selectively eat cisco right before migration. A part of that is because cisco are a really high calorie fatty food item. And so, these first four fish species are some of our most important sport fish in Minnesota. And there's been studies that have shown that these sport fish have higher growth rates and they reach larger maximum sizes in lakes that have cisco. So if you want to catch a big pike, or if you want to catch a big lake trout, those tend to be lakes that have cisco in them. And these plots are from some diet data that's been collected by one of my colleagues, Brian Herwig, who's been looking at muskie diets. And there's a couple lakes in Minnesota, Lake Bemidji and Elk Lake, and both of these lakes, muskie are eating 50% of their diet is coming from cisco. Additionally, these are pretty long-lived species for Minnesota, particularly cisco for prey fish. We've aged them up to 18 years old. And lake whitefish, incredibly, we've aged up to 62 years. So these are long-lived fish, particularly lake whitefish. And then they're also important because they're cold water species and they're sensitive to climate change and degradation of water quality. So I wanted to just touch on why cold water fish are at risk. In Minnesota, our deep lakes stratify in the summer. So that just means that there's different temperature zones. So at the surface, there's sort of the warm, swimmable water. And if you've ever been swimming and you're in that nice warm water and you dive down really deep and you get into that, ooh, it's cold. So you're experiencing the temperature zones in our lakes in Minnesota. So one of the unique things about our lakes is that when they're stratified into these different temperature zones, we have the warm temperatures at the surface, and then there's this rapid changing temperatures, and then down deep, we have these nice cold temperatures, and that's where our cold water species like cisco and lake whitefish like to hang out. But in the summer, when it's stratified, oxygen only gets mixed into the surface waters. So it gets mixed in through wave action from like atmospheric oxygen and then also through aquatic plants. But that oxygen doesn't get down into the deepest, coldest waters. So the only time that those really deep, cold waters get oxygenated is in the spring and the fall when the temperature all becomes the same, and we refer to that as the turnover period. But also what's happening in the summer is we have a lot of production, right? There's like little plants, algae that are growing, we have zooplankton that are growing, and when they live, they die, they sink to the bottom of the lake, and then all this detritus raining down, there's bacteria down there that will break it down, but they use oxygen in the process. So what happens is that oxygen becomes depleted at the bottom. And these cold water fish, they want to be down where it's really deep and cold. When the oxygen runs out, they need to breathe, so they actually get moved up into sort of a warmer temperature zone. So we call this the summer squeeze. This is actual data from Elk Lake in 2013, and it's set up just like a lake. So the depth is on the y-axis here. So this is the surface of the lake, and this is the bottom of the lake. And cisco like to be in this deep, cold, blue waters. And they'll try to avoid these warm, swimmable waters. So those temperatures greater than about 68 degrees, cisco are going to try to avoid those and stay down deep. But if we take out where the oxygen is too low for the fish to breathe, then you can see that over the course of the summer, they get really squeezed into this very narrow depth strata in the water column. And in some years, If there's a really long stratification period, so for example, if the ice goes out really early in the year, it doesn't set in until really late, Cisco can get pushed all the way up into the warm surface waters. Or in some years, if it's really hot and really still, those temperatures can extend down deeper in the water column. And in that situation where Cisco or these cold water species get pushed way up into the warm waters, they become thermally stressed, and that's where we can see Cisco die-offs. So in terms of cold water fish in Minnesota, the main stressors are temperature or climate and land use changes. We have seen that the minimum winter temperatures in Minnesota are getting warmer over time. So in 1925, the average minimum winter temperature about 0 degrees Fahrenheit was down south of Mille Lacs Lake. And actually, the blue lakes here all represent Cisco lakes. So you can see, so that's sort of down where the threshold of Cisco lakes are. That's moved about 100 miles farther north over time. So what we're seeing is that winters are warmer. That means that there's less ice cover. And when there's less ice cover, that means that there's a longer period of stratification. So the ice goes out earlier, it sets in later. And the longer the stratification, the more that oxygen can get used up over the course of the summer. We've also seen some temperatures change in terms of the summer temperature. It hasn't been as drastic as the change in winter temperature, but this dashed line represents the temperature zone of about 66 degrees Fahrenheit, so kind of the upper limit of what Cisco like. And that's also moved farther north. And so that has to do with those warm surface waters. If we have really warm surface waters, if Cisco get pushed up into those and they're too warm, that's where we can have thermal stress and die-offs. And then lastly, there's been some changes in land use over time that has resulted in an increase in productivity. So this map shows total phosphorus, which is a nutrient that comes in off the watershed, off the land into lakes. So if there's more phosphorus, that means the lakes are more productive, they're producing more algae and more zooplankton, and all that filters down to the bottom and is related to how much oxygen gets used up over the course of the stratification. So more production means a higher oxygen demand. So how is the DNR responding to some of these stressors for cold water fish species? Well, currently the DNR is partnering with the MPCA to develop water quality standards to protect lakes that have cold water species like Cisco and lake whitefish. And actually that is open for public comment right now. So we can post a link in the chat where you can go to find out more information about these water quality standards and you can comment on those. There's also been some work to identify Cisco lakes that have really high quality habitat. So these are the lakes that have really good cold oxygenated habitat and they're predicted to continue to have habitat under future climate scenarios. They've been broken up into 2 different tiers. So tier 1 are sort of the best lakes that are expected to have lots of habitat for Cisco well into the future. And tier 2 lakes are kind of lakes that will have some habitat, but maybe not quite as much as tier 1 lakes. And so the Minnesota DNR is actively working with local partners to maintain or improve water quality in lakes that have been identified as refuge lakes. And so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Cory. He's out on the Blue Heron on Lake Superior right now, and he's going to be talking about a really unique fishery, or Lake Superior Cisco. And I'm going to be running the slides for him so that in case his video feed cuts out a little bit, you'll still be able to see the images. All right, Cory, over to you.
Thanks, Beth. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As Beth said, I'm on board the research vessel Blue Heron. It's operated by the University of Minnesota Duluth Large Lakes Observatory. This is part of our annual assessment for Cisco that's been ongoing for well over 10 years now. This survey helps us to set our total allowable catch quota in the commercial fishery on Lake Superior, as well as better understand Cisco population dynamics. Next slide, please, Beth. So to kind of ground ourselves on where we are here, even though Minnesota waters of Lake Superior makes up 2,300 square miles, it's only 7% of the total surface area of the lake. Our waters in Minnesota are broken up into 3 management zones, and each of those management zones has a bit different habitat with a bit different fish assemblage. MN1 is by far our most productive, our shallowest, warmest. This is where in the prey fish assemblage we'll see more rainbow smelt, non-native rainbow smelt, and native floater. MN2 is the deepest of the management zones. And in MN2, prey fish community-wise, we'll see more tie-eye, which is a relative of cisco and whitefish as well. But they're a very deep water form living in the deepest parts of Lake Superior. And MN3 is the largest management zone, and that's kind of a mix habitat type of shallower and deeper depths. And in MN3, we see a pretty decent mix of bloater and kai in the prey fish community. Next slide, please. So Lake Superior is deep and cold, and that really helps to set the productivity of the lake and what it can produce when we talk about fish populations. Over 80% of Lake Superior is greater than 240 feet deep or more. And you can see along our north shore of Minnesota, the light blue is what we call the nearshore waters, 0 to 240 feet. And the dark blue is the offshore waters, which is greater than 240 feet. And you can see along the north shore, our nearshore habitat is very limited, just a very small, thin strip of that water that's shallower than 240 feet deep. Lake Superior is cold, deep, what we call ultra oligotrophic. So it's not very productive in the typical sense that we would consider productivity in lakes. And it's most pristine of the Great Lakes. The watersheds are mostly intact. The water quality is great. We maintained a lot of our native prey fish and predator fish community in Lake Superior, but that doesn't mean that we were not impacted. The turn of the 19th century impacts of clear cut logging, deforestation, wildfires, and habitat degradation in the tributaries and bayments in particular were some of the habitat issues that we had seen on Lake Superior. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
I'm having some technical difficulties here.
Okay.
Shoot, let's see. Maybe here we go. Okay.
So how cold is Lake Superior? This is just a surface water graph looking at Lake Superior and Lake Michigan in July of 2014. And you can see Lake Superior in the beginning of July is, out in the main part of the lake is still hovering around, high 30s, mid to high 30 degrees, whereas Lake Michigan by that point is up into the 50 degrees. So typically, in the summer during a cold water year on Lake Superior, it can be 20 plus degree difference than say Lake Michigan. Next slide, please. We do get ice cover events on Lake Superior, however, and those ice cover events are a fantastic opportunity to get out safely if you can, to do some ice fishing. It's a very popular fishery when it occurs, and it's a neat thing to be able to fish over 100 feet of water in clear water and see the fish come by and strike at your baits. But what we know about ice cover on Lake Superior and Cisco has been interesting through time. Next slide, please. So we know on Lake Superior, ice cover duration has been declining through time. And this is important in consideration with climate change and Cisco in particular, is because a lot of research has been done on Cisco populations through time. And what folks have noticed is that ice cover events are a predictor of whether or not Cisco successfully recruit. Next slide, Beth, please. When we talk about fish recruitment is juvenile survival to the adult stage. So we know that with Cisco on Lake Superior, adults spawn every year, those eggs hatch every year. what we also know is that those young juvenile fish don't always survive to age 1. If they survive to age 1, we know that we'll see them as adults in the spawning population in the future. The picture on the right is from the same survey last year, where we see age 1 cisco, we see adult cisco, and we see to the far right bloater, which is another native fish in the whitefish family. The picture on the left is from, picture on the left is from actually last night after we did our midwater trawl. The bucket on the left is adult cisco again, and the bucket in the middle is age 1 cisco. And the bucket on the right is the bloater kai assemblage that we typically see up here in MN3. Go ahead, Beth. So why are cisco important? In Lake Superior, cisco are an important part of the ecosystem. They transfer energy. So adult cisco typically are out in the pelagic zone of Lake Superior, which is kind of the wide open offshore waters of Lake Superior. As they, in the fall this time of year, as they approach the near shore areas to spawn, they're transferring all that energy collected from the offshore zone into the nearshore zone, especially as they're depositing their eggs for spawning. And research has been done to show that fish species such as lake whitefish in Lake Superior actually benefit from cisco spawning and that energy transfer from offshore to nearshore by actually gaining fat content over winter, which is something that fish species hardly ever do. Nobody gains weight in the fish world over winter. That's usually a time of pretty lean food supplies. The picture on the right is from this spring from the USGS survey, where you see an age 1 cisco about 6 or 7 inches in the stomach of a lake trout that's about 12 or 13 inches. So they're also important as a prey fish for a lot of predators in Lake Superior, especially lake trout. And cisco in particular are interesting because they're really only susceptible to the majority of predators the first 2 or 3 years of life. And then they outgrow what we call the gate limitation, or how big a fish can open its mouth and eat something. By the time they're adults, they're usually bigger than the majority of the predators in Lake Superior, other than maybe the most largest lake trout that we see. So if you had seen in the news this year, this summer, you saw that on Lake Superior, the new record coho salmon was caught. And that has everything to do with the year class event that we saw in 22 that will be talked about here shortly. Next slide, please, Beth. So cisco are important on Lake Superior as well, is because we have a rich history of cisco commercial fishing on Lake Superior, beginning even in the mid 1800s and continuing through today. Next slide, please. We have 2 cisco fisheries, commercial fisheries in Minnesota. In October, November is what we call the roe fishery. Commercial operators are targeting females for their eggs. Those eggs are processed into caviar and are shipped primarily overseas to Sweden. Every other month other than October and November, they're targeting adult cisco for their fillets for local fish fillet markets, restaurants, grocery stores here along the North Shore. Next slide, please. So how do we manage the cisco fishery? We manage primarily by monitoring harvest in the commercial fishery. So monitoring how many pounds of harvest are occurring. We also do some biological sampling of commercial catch. We monitor year class production primarily through the USGS year class estimate survey that they do. It's been going on since 1978. It's a bottom trawl survey. We also have Minnesota DNR samples from commercial catch in the fillet fishery and the roe fishery. Again, those biological samples where we can age cisco. You see the picture in the bottom right. All fish have an ear bone or otolith that you can cut in half and read the rings like a tree, and that'll tell you the age of the fish. We also have independent gillnet surveys, and what we're doing here this week, independent hydroacoustic and midwater trawl surveys. And then all of that rolls into how we calculate total allowable catch quotas in the commercial fishery to ensure that the commercial fishery is sustainable for the future. Next slide, please. So monitoring commercial harvest in the fishery in here in Minnesota, again, the dark gray bars here is the traditional harvest or the fillet harvest that occurs in every month other than October, November. You can see on the left axis is harvest in metric tons. 60s, 70s, you see a decline in harvest through time. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, increasing harvest that had sustained itself for 20 to 30 years. And then you see the November harvest, the roe fishery. This is when those populations are congregated into spawning schools and are easier to catch. So you see the catch per unit effort, which is a metric of abundance or density. You see that in the November fishery being quite a bit higher than what we see in the traditional fishery during the fillet fishery. Next slide, please. So our partners, the USGS out of Ashland on the research vessel Kai, like I mentioned, they had been doing a bottom trawl survey since the late 1970s. They have 70 some stations around Lake Superior that they do a bottom trawl survey on, and what we found through time is the number of age 1 cisco they catch in that survey is a predictor of year class strength. So the red line here is the year class strength for that year. So in 1984, it was an epic year class. So 84, we knew the adults spawned in 83, the eggs hatched in 84, those juveniles lived to age 1, and we saw a lot of adults through time after that. That's why you saw that harvest in the late 80s increase. But what we've seen on Lake Superior through time is smaller year class events and more time in between year class events. So just naturally through time, adult cisco populations have declined, which has been very concerning to us as managers. Next slide, please, Beth. So then what we can do is in our commercial fishery is we can take the otoliths out of some of the ciscos that we get from commercial catch working with other commercial operators, age those fish, and then assign them to a year class. So the blue bars here are year class assignments from our commercial fishery. And we can overlay that with the USGS bottom trawl survey and see that that bottom trawl survey does predict year class strength quite well. And we can see what year classes are contributing to our commercial fishery overall. Next slide, please. And when we look at our roe fishery or our November fishery, which is a very productive fishery, what we had seen recently is those younger year classes, those smaller year classes, contributing the majority to those commercial fisheries, whereas we'd like to see some more consistent recruitment in some of those older ages contributing more to the commercial fishery, because we don't want all of the harvest to be coming from small year class events over time. Next slide, please. So again, sporadic recruitment. Either we need more large year class events like 1984, 88, 90, or 2003, or we need more consistent small year class events through time to maintain adult populations. Next slide. And what we see in the roe fishery with these are bubble plots, and it's just an easier way for us to see. On the bottom is the year or the year class, and the age is on the left axis. And this is a way for us to tell us, like in 2020, we see a lot of younger fish. Go ahead, you can step through those, Beth. You can see in 2020 a lot of those younger fish coming from those younger year classes. But like Beth said, these are old, long-lived fish. We've seen cisco up to well over 30 years of age. Next slide, please. So we also have our hydroacoustic assessment. That's what we're doing out here this week. We're on board the research vessel Blue Heron. This is our primary method of setting our total allowable catch quota. And the whole purpose of this survey is to estimate adult abundance, so then we can allocate a portion of that adult population to commercial harvest to ensure long-term sustainability of the resource. Next slide, please. Well, through time, even since 2013 or so, our hydroacoustic surveys have shown this decline in cisco. Again, just because we have not seen large year class events, and we're relying on these smaller year class events to maintain that adult abundance. But like I mentioned earlier, the picture on the right here is from last year, where we did see a very good recruitment event from the 2022 year class. Initial estimates by the USGS for year class strength is saying that perhaps the 2022 year class could double the strength of the 1984 year class, which is just an epic number of cisco, adult cisco, coming into the population here in the next 3 years. Next slide, please. So then all of this wraps up into how we calculate individual total allowable catch quotas for commercial operators. So we take the overall abundance estimate of adult cisco. We're very conservative in our allocation of what we give out to the commercial fishery. We only take 10% of that abundance estimate. And then we remove some of the harvest that has occurred through the year and allocate for each zone a total quota, and then allocate to each commercial operator an individual quota. So a very conservative way of allocating cisco populations to the commercial fishery, again, to maintain the long-term sustainability of that fishery. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to throw in some table fare and some of my favorite ways of cooking cisco. Cisco is a delicate tasting fish, very good table fare. My favorite recipe is a blackened cisco in a cast iron pan, just a real quick hard sear on them, and then it gives you 2 meals out of it. So you get your blackened cisco meal with asparagus or broccoli, and then your leftovers you can turn into blackened fish tacos, which I like to do quite a bit of, with a cilantro lime sauce and a little bit of cabbage and cilantro on top of that. So if you have the opportunity to pick up some cisco here along the North Shore, or find it in some restaurants, it's a very delicious fish species here from Lake Superior.
Excellent, Cory. Thank you so much for that information. I'm really glad you were able to join us from out on the lake, actually, out by just outside of Grand Marais, you said. So that's really cool. And Beth, thanks for all the great information. While EJ is getting his presentation set up, we're going to transition him to do that. I do want to remind folks that we do again have the Q&A in the bottom right corner. Those 3 dots or ellipses, if you click on those, you can access Q&A and you can put in questions, and we'll get those after EJ finishes his talk. We'll get those questions answered for you. So please take advantage of that. EJ, it's really good to have you here because actually Cory wetted the whistle for talking about harvest and how folks can actually get out and harvest and actually eat these fish. So thank you for joining us. You are still muted.
Yep, one second.
Yep. Looking good.
All right, you able to see the presentation?
Yep, I think we're good to go.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I'm really excited to be able to give this talk with my colleagues here. I think it's a nice contrast. You learned about cisco and whitefish populations and biology, and I feel I've got a little bit of the fun spot where I get to describe and talk about angling, or I should say netting opportunities for cisco and whitefish on inland lakes here in Minnesota.
You have your video off. Are you able to turn that on?
Oh, I'm sorry. Give me
That's
one
all right.
second.
Folks can see you. That'd be good.
Did I pop up?
Not yet. I don't know if you can access the
I don't
options
see
at the bottom of the screen. At the bottom of WebEx, there's the sharing video or stop video, and where you mute and unmute. If you can't, that's all right too. We can just go ahead.
That option might disappear when you're sharing, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you
just
start
go ahead.
sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my apologies that
no problem.
don't have that available for you guys at the moment.
Or you can see your
So-
screen, so you're all good.
So thank you. We're talking about Cisco and Lake Whitefish, and Beth kind of gave a nice little overview on where those fish feed and live, and these fish live in essentially deep, relatively clear, cold water lakes. They're primarily planktivorous and eating invertebrates and bugs, and they have relatively small mouths. So for trying to catch a lake whitefish in really deep water with a small bait, that's really challenging, even through the ice when most people try to. And Cisco is a pelagic fish that swims around in the water eating really small invertebrates, and they're kind of incidentally caught angling through the ice. So you don't really have much of a or a significant harvest for these fish on lakes. And in the fall, these fish kind of move in toward shore for spawning, and that kind of gives a unique opportunity where you have lakes with perhaps robust populations of these fish species to offer an opportunity to do some gill netting in shallow water to harvest these fish. And although they call it a sport gill netting license, we're really talking about a subsistence netting license, because these fish are delicious, as Cory showed some nice images of table fare. These fish are great to eat. So what does this license give you? So if you're a Minnesota resident and you buy an angling fishing license, you can then buy a sport gill netting license for Cisco and whitefish. And it's not necessarily a license like you're used to getting, where there's a daily bag limit for harvesting fish through angling. This is more of a restricted season and effort and the type of net you can use to harvest these fish. So here, let's see if you can see, let me grab a tool. There we go. If you can see my laser pointer, if you're not familiar with what a gill net is, here's a quick description. You have a gill net mesh that has weights on the bottom and floats or float line on the top, so it stands up kind of like a fence. And the mesh itself is either a mono or multi-filament. It's a very thin material designed to encapture the fish by the fish swimming into it, and it kind of gets lodged behind its gills and it can't back itself out, so it kind of gets wedged in there. This net is brought to the lake bottom via some anchors to keep it on the bottom, and then a line up to the surface to mark it with floats. So you're essentially fishing this net right on the bottom. So this license has restrictions on the gear you can use, and that's a 100-foot gill net by 3 feet tall in size. You're only allowed to fish one net per person, and that the floats and buoys need to be marked with identification of the permitter. And depending if you're fishing for whitefish or Cisco, there's different mesh sizes that you use. So it's a 3.5-inch minimum mesh size for whitefish. That fish is a bit bigger. So the size of the mesh, or the holes essentially in the net, are bigger. If you're fishing for Cisco, it's a smaller 1.75 inch for capturing those fish. You set these nets in really shallow water. We're talking 6 feet or shallower is what you're required to fish. What that does is you're fishing really this nearshore area where the majority of the game fish have moved off into deeper, essentially warmer water. So it's an opportunity to fish where you're not going to catch walleye or northern pike or bass. It's kind of these really cold areas that provide really nice contrast to what you're typically doing in angling. Now you have to check that net every day. And if you do capture game fish, again, this could be like walleye or northern pike, those fish need to be taken out of the net and tossed back to the lake. However, whatever you catch for Cisco and whitefish is essentially there isn't a bag limit, but you can keep all those Cisco and whitefish that you catch, which is really great. Now you might think, wow, that sounds like a lot of fish. we may be talking about anywhere between 1 to 8 fish per net might be something reasonable to expect. So you're kind of wondering now, well, how do you do that? Most of the folks that go out and participate are using a small boat or canoe to set these nets. They're by hand, they're short, it's a 100-foot net. And you're attaching some anchors, some lines to buoys. You're doing this in really shallow water. You're usually trying to find some areas that have a sandy gravel or small rock or cobble. We're not looking at setting this over boulders or in mucky areas. So you're trying to target where these fish are coming in to spawn. Now, a lot of times in the fall, you're getting ice conditions. And as the season goes on or progresses, sometimes you're setting these nets under the ice. That's a little bit more complicated, but we can definitely answer any questions if people have at the end about setting nets under the ice. It's really great to have two people to do this. One person kind of maneuvering the boat or canoe, and one other person to kind of pay out the net or set it out of the vessel into the water. So I'm sure there's a bunch of people that are really excited to try this. I think it's great to get into doing it, great to do with the family, even with the kids. And thought it'd be nice to give you some helpful tips. The biggest thing is you want to do this when you've got good weather. If you're going to be doing this work out of a canoe or a small boat, you don't want to have to fight the wind and the waves and poor weather. So you really have to pick your days for not only setting your nets, but knowing you're going to come back the next day to check those nets. And you want good weather. You also want to make sure that all your gill net, your line, everything is nice and neat. It's really good to tie it all up together, put it in, say, a tote, put it in your vessel, and then you can start on the one side, toss out a float, some line, anchor. It's all connected and it goes out nice and easy. With that said, you want to make sure there's nothing in your boat or canoe that's going to catch this gill net on. So the gill net's designed to catch fish, so it's definitely going to get hung up if you've got a rod holder, an oar, anything that's not nice and smooth over the side of your boat. You also want to make sure that you set these nets kind of with the wind, or let the wind kind of aid you in the direction that you're setting the net. There's no need to try to fight the net and not get it straight. And that's important to help catching fish. You want to dress appropriately. You're doing this in end of October through November, sometimes into December, and it can get downright blizzardy out there. So the other component, if you talk about, lifting these gill nets, you want to lift from the downward side. You want to paddle down and pull yourself along the net. Now, you don't have to pull the net into your boat and pull the fish out. You can almost just pull the net up as high as you can reach and look to see if you have fish in there and pull out the fish as you move through your net. So the net kind of stays in the water, and then you can just put the fish in your bucket or cooler. And when you get to the end of your net, paddle hard and kind of pull your net tight again. You don't have to take the time to pull it out of the water and then put it back and reset everything. So statewide, there's usually about 700 people that participate in this sort of opportunity. And it's across, I don't know, 12.5 counties that have lakes open to this sort of netting opportunity. They're highlighted in blue. And they're mostly, we talk about these cold water lakes, we're talking about the northeast and northern part of Minnesota. Now, each lake has a designation. If it's for Cisco harvest, you've got that 1.75" mesh minimum restriction. Otherwise, for whitefish lakes, have a 3.5" mesh minimum size to follow if you're fishing in that water body. There's also some different dates. There's a Schedule 1 lakes that kind of get opened right before the season occurs, and then there's a scheduled series of lakes that have all predetermined dates for when they open. So this is just a quick shot of, there's a table online you can look at that the DNR produces that you can see where in your county are there lakes to fish, what can you fish for with the different mesh sizes, and then the date ranges on when you can fish in that lake. So it spells it out nicely. So getting down to the meat and potatoes here, these fish are really good to eat and they're really healthy. So a lot of times they're lower in contaminants than other predatory fish like northern pike, walleye. They're great sources of omega-3 fatty acids. As Cory's talked about, they're really nice, white, flaky, mild tasting fillets that people really love. They'll really take any seasoning you put on them. They're also nice and oily, so they work great in a smoker. They're great for smoking. You can also deep fry them, bake them, grill them, make them into fish cakes or burgers. We could go on and on. There's really a lot of great uses for these fish. Just kind of off the top of my head, I like making baked whitefish. You can just fillet the fish, take the skin off, little lemon pepper, onions, garlic, butter, wrap it in foil, bake it in the oven, a little bit of lemon. It's delicious, really healthy way to eat fish. Very simple. Smoking, say Cisco, you can just dress or gut the fish. You can leave the scales on. You're adding it into a brine, which is like essentially water, salt, sugar, letting it soak overnight. And then you rinse it off, put it in your smoker for a few hours at low heat, and just enjoy. So I just wanted to make a link available that there's more information through the Minnesota DNR's website to talk about the permitting process as well as the regulations for the netting. And it spells everything out for those folks that are looking at getting into that opportunity. And with that, I'd like to just say thanks for this opportunity, and hopefully we can have some good discussion.
Thanks, EJ. You got me really hungry now. That was really good information, and I appreciate you covering all that. On the slide there was the contact information for all of our guests today, but you can find them through the Department of Natural Resources website too, I'm sure. But thanks for joining us. We did get a couple of questions. Couple of these are for EJ. You triggered some folks that are interested in learning more.
Wonderful.
I believe it's Spencer or even it said we live on a lake north of Grand Rapids that has ciscos. They said they have a flight of what they thought were whistler ducks. Thinking that they could be after cisco eggs. Do you think that might be possible? And what depth do they actually these ciscos actually spawn at?
Well, I think that's a interesting question. You know, I'm a little bit less familiar about some of the interactions between the wildlife and say waterfowl with trying to find some of these fish. Definitely, I would doubt that they're targeting eggs, but actual forage themselves, they're finding some bait fish or perhaps some schooling ciscos. Ciscos seem to be a little bit more of an open water type shoaly spawner. So you can think of nearshore areas usually adjacent to reefs or on reefs or where that spawning is occurring, which is a little bit further offshore than lake whitefish, which is spawning really in just a couple feet of water close to shore.
So yeah, so they're not coming like right up to the edge of shore, probably. They're going to be
the ciscos would be offshore.
Okay. Andy was wondering if we're ever going to see a limit per season on the number of, I assume the number of anglers or the number of fish taken. And on Whitefish Lake, it looks like he commented on some of what you shared about how long they are in the overharvest, the potential for overharvest. He's saying he's seen a lot of different sizes of classes on some of the lakes he's netted. And I guess I was wondering too, you know, Beth, you touched on how some of these fish are so old, but maybe stunted, right? So do we have a good idea of harvest having an impact on the overall population, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think EJ could also answer this question, but I've talked to some area fisheries supervisors, and I think we know how many licenses are being bought to harvest sport fish, but I don't think we have always a good handle exactly on how much harvest is occurring. I do think that some of these lakes where we see really long-lived lake whitefish are actually because they're not over harvested. So a lot of times in a fishery where there's a lot of harvest taking place, we'll actually see sort of a response where they mature earlier. And at least the lakes that we've looked at, they're pretty long lived and then they're maturing later, which suggests that they're not probably being over harvested, but that's just in a couple lakes. We actually don't have a ton of really good lake whitefish data. We have more Cisco data than we have lake whitefish data, but yeah, that's an area where I think there is some interest in maybe trying to collect more data in the future.
Okay, thanks. Mike was wondering, what is the procedure to harvest ciscos and lakes with spiny water fleas, regarding, I assume that, handling of the nets and things like that, and transferring to the other lakes. Are there restrictions on that, EJ?
There are restrictions. The question was about infested waters, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so I kind of gave an overview or summary of some of the regulations as far as the sport netting is concerned. And yes, your nets need to be transported in sealed containers. And if you're fishing in an infested water body, say with spiny water fleas, a good example, those nets need to dry out and freeze and not contaminate an additional lake. So there's a period you need to keep that net out of the water for if you plan on transferring it to fishing in another lake.
And those that information is on our regulations online, is that correct?
That is correct. Yep. It's
Yeah, and I
essentially a really nice one pager that bullets out all the requirements for that license.
Thanks. And Benji posted that link, I believe, in the chat.
Yeah.
Cory, I got a question for you. We've seen a lot of the last couple of years. You were saying we had a pretty good hatch, and do you have any thoughts on what we attribute that to, the last couple of years being better?
Yeah, in the presentation, I said ice cover was one of the things that researchers have kind of put their fingers on as to a predictor of a potential year class event for Cisco. However, in 2022, we really didn't have a good ice cover event, but what we did have was really cold water temperatures throughout the spring. So it appears, and there's ongoing research going on looking at the environmental factors in Cisco recruitment. It appears like that cold water in the spring is one of the indicators, and research that was done a while ago indicates that it's perhaps could be what's called the mismatch hypothesis, where as those juvenile or young Cisco are hatching out of their eggs, they have a period of time where they can feed off their external yolk sac. And once they absorb all the nutrients from their yolk sac, then there has to be an external food source. And it seems like the cold water in the spring allows for a zooplankton hatch to occur as those larval Cisco are depleting their yolk sac. So there's an external food source for them to eat once they do run out of that yolk sac. So it appears that's most likely the case is food availability as they're moving on into kind of their next stage of life. The other part of it is we really don't know what happens on Lake Superior winter. We can sample from April to about the beginning of November, and that's really it. From the rest of the season on throughout the winter, we don't know what's going on out here on the Big Lake.
Great, thank you. Mike, I'm not sure if this is who wants to answer this one, but he thinks that or saw that the DNR or herd displaced Cisco's on Burnside Lake by Ely with smelt, and he was wondering why that was done and now the smelt are stunted. So why did that happen?
Well, I don't know the particulars of Burnside Lake, but I can speak more generally. We have several lakes in Minnesota where rainbow smelt, I don't know if they're put there intentionally or if, sometimes people move them in because back in the 70s, people loved to smelt on Lake Superior, and it was even more fun to smelt other lakes as well. So I know of at least 3 lakes that in Minnesota where they were Cisco lakes, but rainbow smelt, once they get into lake, they both compete with and also predate upon a larval Cisco. And so And almost all of the inland lakes that I know of where rainbow smelt come in, Cisco no longer can, they become extirpated. So rainbow smelt become the primary offshore forage.
Okay, thank you. Andy was wondering if there's been much research into heavy metal contaminant loads in the fat along the lateral lines of Lake Whitefish. He's been told that removing the fat line along the fillet is good practice to avoid those metals, but was wondering if you have any facts behind that.
Maybe I'll say I don't know of any studies that specifically looked at that part of the fillet being higher in contaminants than say other parts of the flesh. But definitely some of those other contaminants or heavy metals can accumulate in organ tissue. So removing some of the, not eating, livers, it can be a thing to do if you're sensitive to taking those contaminants. And definitely removing some of the fat is another technique, but I don't know anything specifically that addresses it in a very in say whitefish fillets.
Okay.
Also, what I've
ahead,
noticed
Cory.
with the darker meat spot along the lateral line is if you have folks in your family that don't like really tasting fish, removing that portion of the fillet helps to keep it from being, kind of that more fishy tasting, especially when we're talking Cisco and Lake Superior.
Okay, good point. I have one other question, and we're actually running close out of time here, but we talked about how these are sensitive fish with the cold weather and the warm weather, but they're they're cold water fish. But we always like to hit on stewardship and on this in the series, obviously, and so I know there's been some research as far as what people can do to help protect these species. Planting trees, right? Woodlands and having intact forests is really critical, right?
Yeah, I'd say especially, in our inland lakes, focusing on trying to protect the watershed as much as possible because we, the amount of nutrients that come into the lake that directly is related to how much oxygen gets consumed in the lake over the course of the summer. So, it's planting lake shores with natural habitat, making sure you're not fertilizing lawns down to the lakeside, planting trees, having rain gardens, all those things can help reduce the amount of nutrient inputs.
Yeah, and related to that, we've talked a little about invasives, and so trying to reduce, any movement of invasive species is really critical. But we're seeing a lot of lakes that are getting clearer because of zebra mussels. Do we know what kind of impact that has on Cisco lakes?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. It's something we're looking at through our long-term monitoring program, the Sentinel Lakes program. Maybe we can put a link up for that as well. But we know that zebra mussels, because they make the water clearer, that they can reduce the amount of productivity and sort of reduce the amount of oxygen demands, which is beneficial for cold water fish. But we also know that they tend to move a lot of the nutrients from offshore to nearshore. And so, for example, we see a response in a lot of fish that end up foraging more. They get more of their food from really nearshore areas, and Cisco don't have that ability to do that. So they might improve some of the water quality a little bit for cold water fish, but they also reduce the amount of food in the offshore area.
To be determined, it sounds like.
Yes.
Well, we've run out of time. I really appreciate everybody that joined us today and our experts. It was really great to have you and talk about this really cool fish. And again, we appreciate everyone being here. We will have next week a really interesting talk. We've got a talk about knives and selecting a knife. And obviously it's we're moving into a lot of hunting season, so it'll be a great opportunity to learn about which knife you need and how to take care of it. And then on November 1st, we're gonna have a really great talk on elk in Minnesota, some of the biology and history around elk and some management things that are happening in Minnesota related to elk. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you to our presenters and have a good week. Get outside.